Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And in this video, I'll be ranking the new Journey to Un'Goro class legendary quests from worst to best. Now keep in mind that I won't just be ranking these quests based on the raw power output of their reward, but I'll also be considering how easy it is to build a deck around the quest and how difficult it might be to fulfill the quest. So in other words, this is a measure of what I think their overall competitive viability in a real sense will be, not just how crazy the result is if the quest is successful. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into the rankings. Up first at my number 9 spot, or the worst of the legendary quests, unfortunately I think it goes to Rogue with the Caverns Below. This is one that I really do like the reward with Crystal Core. Being able to summon an endless horde of 5/5 minions very efficiently is awfully cool. Like, that can be very, very powerful, obviously. But the problem with Caverns Below is that I think it's going to be a tad too difficult to actually fulfill or complete this quest in a competitively viable deck. In other words, of course, it's not hard to summon 4 minions of the same name. You can do that with cards like Shadow Step and Youthful Brewmaster and the various ways that Rogue has to create duplicate copies of cards upon card draw. But unfortunately, when you do that and you rely on that gimmick in order to complete this quest, that means you're sacrificing a lot in the consistency and reliability of your deck, particularly when it comes to board presence and tempo, because playing a minion and then pulling it back and playing it again usually means that you're giving something up on the board instead of just developing an extra minion. So despite the fact that this is not that hard to complete, and the fact that the reward is pretty good, unfortunately I think you're compromising the integrity of your deck too much for the Caverns Below to actually be playable in a competitive environment. And as we move on to the number 8 spot, that's actually a theme that continues here with Paladin's The Last Kaleidosaur. This is another one where the reward with Galvadon seems incredibly good. Galvadon is the kind of card that can definitely swing a game in your favor, sometimes downright end a game if you get something like Stealth and Wind Fury and you have some remaining buffs in hand. But with the Last Kaleidosaur, again, you're sacrificing the integrity of your deck, because if you're including so many buffs that you want to get this effect out consistently and early in a game, that means it's harder to include early game minions, and that means you're relying on your hero power to cast buffs, and essentially you're going to be falling behind constantly as you're trying to finish this quest. And even if you play Galvadon, sometimes it might just be a little bit too late. Your opponent will have already assembled too much value on the board, or may have just outright killed you by that point. So the Last Kaleidosaur fails simply because of the design of the condition that has to be met, not necessarily based on how difficult it is or how good the reward might be. Moving on to the number 7 spot is a quest I think is more fundamentally sound than the previous 2 choices. And by that I mean summoning 10 Murlocs isn't that hard. And in fact, building a deck in that regard has been successful in the past. Just a flood Murloc style where you get a ton of Murlocs out onto the board and utilize their internal synergies. That's going to allow you to build a big board in the early game. Sometimes maybe just kill your opponents because Murlocs can be scary. And then Megafan is awesome as a reward as well, because he's a giant body that will refill your hand, and typically Murloc decks have run out of gas once they've flooded the board, so Megafin does help prevent that issue that has been problematic for these kinds of decks in the past. So all of that makes sense and works together. I think the real problem with this card is that it just doesn't give you enough long-term value or a big enough swing turn like many of the future quests on this list will do. So despite the fact that this is really quite good, and a month ago before Journey to Un'Goro I would have thought this was a ridiculously overpowered combo, in the context of all these other quest cards, I just don't think Unite the Murlocs is quite good enough, which actually says a lot about how good the rest of this list actually can be. As we move on to the number 6 spot with Warlock's Lakkari Sacrifice, this one is another one that has an interesting spin in that I'm not sure the quest reward here is totally overpowered. It might not even be as good as the previous card's reward, but building a deck right now around the discard mechanic that Lakkari Sacrifice encourages seems like it's going to be way too strong. Warlock has received a lot of good discard cards in Journey to Unguro, including its new legendary minion. Already had some strong discard cards, and discard as a mechanic is something that used to be so punishing, but now it seems like it's almost going to be rewarded between this quest and a bunch of the new cards. So building a discard Warlock deck just looks very good. And the fact that Nether Portal awaits you on the end of that, which is a fact that clearly has a lot of long-term value and summons, again, essentially an endless army of minions, this time only 3/2 imps, but they just keep coming 2 per turn forever, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it. So that provides some inevitability, but frankly, sometimes I think you're just going to win the game on discard value anyway, but if somehow that doesn't work out and all your discard stuff just happens to hit wrong, Nether Portal is still the kind of effect that can bail you out of a game and find a win. So since you have such a strong deck strategy in the first place, that seems like it's just going to overwhelm opponents, but then you have a sort of backup plan with Nether Portal that's just going to help you pile on to what's already working for your deck. This just seems very, very good. Up next at my number 5 spot is the Fire Plume's Heart for Warrior. This quest requires you to play 7 taunt minions, so it seems like Blizzard finally found a way to truly make Warrior the taunt class. And Warrior already had a couple good taunts. They're getting a couple good taunts, new ones with Unguro, so there's going to be enough taunts to play, which would have been my biggest concern with this deck. But it seems like some of these taunts are so strong, it won't even really feel bad playing them most of the time. And since aggro is such a dominant force in the meta, basically in every era of Hearthstone, having this many taunt minions can really help counter aggro. But one of the biggest problems you've always had in decks designed to counter aggressive starts is that they usually aren't good in control versus control matchups. In other words, they're better at countering aggro, but they're not truly control v control decks. They just don't have enough threats of their own and enough late game bodies to do that. But with Fire Plume's Heart, finally Warrior will be able to counter aggro with early game taunts, but then also slide into late game value thanks to Fire Plume's Heart, and specifically the reward Sulfuros, which gives you a nice little weapon, but that's not obviously the real goal here. The real goal is turning your hero power into Ragnaros' effect, which is that you get to deal 8 damage to a random enemy for 2 mana. And in a control environment, essentially that is an unbelievable tool because it's just going to keep removing minions. It occasionally is going to hit face to apply pressure, and it's going to give Warrior the depth that they need to contest that control environment, even if they're teched very aggressively against aggro. So in a past where you had to kind of split a deck in half for counter tools and then control tools, that could be very difficult and it could be hard to make it work. But this gives you one out, one tool that's going to make you so good that it won't feel so bad to split your deck in half. Because sometimes you draw your Sylvanas and your Ragnaros and your Grom against aggro and you'd lose. And other times you draw your early game aggro counter cards against a control priest and you'd lose. That's no longer a problem because no matter what, you have some inevitability that you know you're going to have an answer for control thanks to Sulfuros. So this card seems like it's going to kind of redesign and reshape how Warrior works and finally give it a full breadth of range against a variety of decks that it needs to succeed. Moving on to my next card, it's Druid's Jungle Giants. And this is one that I'm afraid people are sleeping on because I think Barnabas' effect is actually really strong. Reducing minions to 0 can provide crazy board presence swings in a single turn as long as you have card draw. And that's what a lot of people are citing as the problem for this quest in general, is that it requires a lot of card draw to fill your hand up with enough threats that the mana reduction is actually significant to get them all out in a single turn. Which is all fine and dandy, but that kind of forgets the fact that Druid often wants to combine spells with minions in a single turn, and they can't do so. Not to mention the fact that Jungle Giants, to me, already supports the 2 sort of archetypes of Druid that are successful right now, the first of which is Jade, and the second of which is Combo. This quest is summon 5 minions, not play, so Jade is eventually going to fulfill Jungle Giants at some point in the game, which means you're going to get 0 cost Gadgets and Auctioneers, which means that those can go off like crazy with Jade Idols, but also any minions that you draw along the way, which usually wouldn't have been playable, say Aya, Jade Spirit, Jade Behemoth, now means you can play them all at once and just go absolutely insanely wide on your board and just provide a game-ending turn all at once. But more importantly than Jade, I think combo gets really interesting with Barnabas because of the card Malygos. Used to, you have to run Aviana, Kun, and Malygos together to pull off a very specific kind of combo with Malygos, and that means you had to get all 3 cards in hand, and that was a bit of a restriction because you had to draw into the exact stuff in the right order, and you had to stay alive in the meantime. But with Jungle Giants, Malygos costs 0. He's a 1-card combo. Of course, you have to have the burst as well, but it's 1 minion versus 3 minions required, which means you can include a little extra burst in your deck. You can run Starfire as Malygos burst alongside 2 Moonfires and a swipe, right? You can do crazier stuff and include more card draw because you can just rifle through your deck quicker. As long as you have the tools for survivability, Barnabas is going to set up some very interesting combo plays. I mean, you could even squeeze in a Leroy to add to your combo, right? There's all kinds of crazy stuff you could do when you have 0 cost minions. So I feel like people are forgetting that, the game-ending potential of Barnabas. They're thinking of this more as a sort of long-term value, tempo, board kind of play, and I'm trying to think of it more in a game-finishing sense, which I think is really important, and I'll probably talk about later with the card Time Warp. So don't sleep on Jungle Giants. I actually like this one quite a bit. Up next is another card I fear that people might be underrating a little bit, and that is Priests Awaken the Makers. And with this one, after summoning 7 Death Rattle minions, you get Amara, the Warden of Hope, and she's a giant 8/8 taunt that sets your hero's health to 40. That means even if you're at 30 health, you do get a small benefit from Amara, not to mention the giant body. But if you're at 1 health, you get an even bigger benefit. And people are saying Priest is going to be really bad in Journey to Unguro. I'm not convinced of that. I think Death Rattles are strong enough, and there's enough low-cost ones to make it quite good. Plus, I mean, Hearthstone's metas always tend towards aggro. Especially lately, there's always really fast decks. And basically for the last year and a half, Reno has been the #1 answer to that. There's been aggro and there's been Reno. With Reno Lock, Reno Mage, just historically Reno has been your tool. You draw Reno on 6, you beat the aggro deck most of the time. Reno is rotating out, and Amara Warden of Hope is the next closest thing. Now, I feel like people are just ignoring that fact that she is the perfect answer to aggressive starts. Not only because she's a taunt, but because she's a giant, even bigger, in fact, Reno effect. So if you're trying to keep up and you're trying to stomp out aggro decks, what better choice do you have than Awaken the Makers and Amara? And really, for that sole reason, even though Amara is probably from a raw value standpoint the worst of all these quests, because she's just something you play once and you get a one-time effect from her. It's not something that affects the rest of the game forever and summons infinite stuff, but it's just that one swing turn, the one chance to shut down your opponent, that I think is actually strong enough and relevant enough compared to the history of Hearthstone's metas that makes Awaken the Makers one of the best. But there are 2 more cards I think are better. Up first is the Mage Quest, Open the Waygate. With this one, as soon as you cast 6 spells that didn't start in your deck, so anything summoned from Kabbalist Tome, even the coin counts, and there's a bunch of new spells that are and minions that are going to generate these, so it's not going to be hard to meet that condition. But you get to take an extra turn. That's right, you get to hit the end turn button. Guess what? It doesn't actually end your turn. You get a whole nother one. So there's all kinds of crazy things you can do with this. People are already dreaming up what they're calling the Exodia combo, which I think is from like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something. But it essentially involves 4 Sorcerer's Apprentices and Archmage Antonidas and Infinite Fireballs. It is actually possible. It's not going to be that easy to fulfill all that and get everything in your hand at the right time. But that's a possible combination. There's also stuff like playing 4 giants in a single turn and then getting them to attack when you take your time warp turn. So there's all kinds of OTK, or you could sort of call it 2TK because it's a 2-turn combo technically with time warp. ways to kill your opponent. So bringing back almost a freeze mage or combo mage style that's going to find lethal, which is all really good. I think that sounds great, and it's probably going to be how this is played, but I don't even think you have to take it that far and figure it out. Essentially, anytime you're able to make really big swings in Hearthstone, that's usually very powerful, and it's the kind of thing that wins you the game, and that's exactly what Time Warp is going to do. Even if you're not pulling off those crazy combos, just having the time to take a turn and take initiative on the board is usually going to be enough to pull you ahead, in my mind. Because Hearthstone, as much as people like to talk about these kinds of infinite value cards like Lakkari Sacrifice, for instance, it's really being able to make something happen immediately and do it quickly and decisively that usually wins you games. So those infinite value cards, like, yes, eventually those would win you a game, but this is the kind of card that ends a game immediately, and that to me is why it stands above the rest. And yet it's not number one. That honor for me goes to the Marsh Queen, Hunter's new legendary quest. And there's really one reason I put this card on the top, and that is always there's two things that tend to dominate Hearthstone in new expansions. That's aggro decks, and that's really strong one-drops. And this card actually encourages both of those things. So you're going to be able to build a deck here that essentially is full of good one-drop minions. And Hunter actually got a few new good early game cards that are all going to work well together. And then as soon as you play 7 of them, which isn't going to be hard at all, then you're going to get an amazing reward in Queen Carnassa. And her Battlecry is going to shuffle you 15 new one-drops into your deck, which means you're always going to have a pretty consistent curve because those one-drops are 3/2 bodies that also cycle a card. So you're just going to basically be able to refill the board almost every turn. The likelihood of getting some dead draws in your deck is possible just because the Raptors won't always necessarily come in order. But as long as your deck is built in the right way and designed to shuffle through cards, you're going to have a just infinite stream of value with Queen Carnassa. When you combine that with stuff like Tundra Rhino specifically, the thoughts here get incredibly scary. It just seems like this is going to work too well together. The deck sort of builds itself in many ways, and the Marsh Queen, I suspect, will be one of the more frustrating cards to play against in Hearthstone, just because it's going to be so fast and so scary, and I'm not really sure there's any downside to playing this. So that to me is why the Marsh Queen is the number one legendary quest. And there you have it. That's my list. Those are my rankings for the legendary quests from worst to best. Now, I'm sure you guys have some thoughts of your own. I'd love to hear your take on this list. What takes your number one spot? What's the worst legendary quest in your mind? Share all that in the comments below, and I'll certainly be happy to read everything you've got. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.